So hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ethan Kent with Placemaking X. I want to start by thanking World City residents, Chris Fair for having us be part of this, for taking such a holistic view of cities, for challenging us to think bigger and think more creatively about cities, bringing so many different voices, perspectives together. For many years I've known Chris in residence, and they've constantly challenged me deeply, but also elevated us and challenged us to think about how placemaking can have a bigger impact. And this moment, this conference is much needed for where we're at coming out of the pandemic, is we all need to think bigger about the impact we can have and what we can all do together collectively. In really what is a sort of a small world of urbanists globally, where what I find is wonderful is that we all know each other, but the learning curve is huge. So there's so much we have to learn together. And while this is a wonderfully global conversation, it's wonderful to feel so connected globally and to do this virtually. I'd also like to start by having us all sort of acknowledge the original inhabitants of our land and connect deeper with the longer term placemaking that's occurred where we all are. I'm on the original land of the Lenape here in what's now Brooklyn, New York. And such acknowledgements I think are important, not only to recognize, largely erased cultures and who's not been included in the shaping of places over time, to acknowledge those people, but to help us all connect deeper to the places we're in, and the longer term changes in the past and in the future that we're all really a small part of. So the title that we've been given for this conversation is Placemaking Forever, which is provocative, and it challenges us to reflect again on this sort of indigenous placemaking and what is indigenous placemaking. Actually, one of our Placemaking X colleagues, that's leader of the Placemaking in New Zealand, Aotearoa network, says that we don't need indigenous placemaking, we need all placemaking to be indigenous. We need everyone to feel more connected to the long-term stories of place and a storied approach to placemaking. But this title also challenges us to reflect on the placemaking movement that many of us have been working to build over recent decades, and how do we go differently going forward. And then, of course, I think one of the main intentions was for it to look at, questioning the permanence of many of the new placemaking activities that have occurred during the pandemic that are really exciting, and some of our panelists will discuss as well. These should they stay forever? How do we sustain them? How do we make sure they don't perpetuate the status quo? And how do we help them address more systemic inequities, challenges, sustainability issues in our communities? So, the pandemic has caused us to slow down and connect deeper to the places we're in, to people that are in our communities. It's often caused us to connect to the street, to reclaim it to some extent, through the open streets that we've seen, through the struteries, and some communities are thriving. The places, frankly, where people have organized to collectively build what we call sort of place governance, where they're all competing to contribute to the shared value of each other. Those parts of New York on a micro level, whether it's a street level or a neighborhood level, those are really thriving, where places that didn't have that cooperation, that collaboration, informal or formal governance, frankly, are hurting a little more. And I think that's true in rural areas. It's true, we're seeing that being true, around the world. So I'm going to start actually with Peter Smith, who's really been my biggest mentor on many levels, but especially around the topic of place governance. Peter helped us a movement with UN Habitat over 10 years ago to make public space and placemaking a global cause. And we worked to get public space to be one of the Sustainable Development Goals and to be included in the New Urban Agenda. We successfully got 10 mentions of key principles of placemaking in the New Urban Agenda for the 2016 Habitat 3. But shortly after that, he helped us found Placemaking X to figure out how to actually implement placemaking and scale the impact. Move beyond just the awareness and the trend of placemaking to actually using place and placemaking as a tool to bring together many different disciplines, sectors, causes to support the systemic change that's needed to address our bigger societal challenges. So Peter, you're now the CEO of Port Phillip, which is a beautiful section of Melbourne, Australia, the waterfront part of Melbourne, Australia, and you've been leading the placemaking conversation around Australia for a long time. Tell us what you've learned in the pandemic, what you've seen is going differently. What's Australia doing well? Give us a sense of what's happening there.
Thanks, Ethan, and thanks for the invite. Hello, everyone. Look, I've been a city manager for the last 15 years, and I remember when we started talking about placemaking and place governance, we talked about needing to dance differently as government, and I often regarded myself as needing to be almost viral within government, and I use that word deliberately. I never thought it would be a coronavirus that caused the shift in people's mindsets towards public place. But what we've seen, and I'm talking to you all from Melbourne, which is we've just ticked over, I think, the world's most locked down city. So the value of public space for social connection, for economic recovery and resilience, and for creative capital, which are all the things that place gives us, has been huge. So, I was saying to you, Ethan, earlier, 2 years pre-pandemic, we were struggling to get placemaking on the agenda and get councils to understand the value of public space beyond the physical infrastructure. Now I think every council in metropolitan Melbourne's become a placemaker. The government's freed up funds. I got a check from the state government for $1.7 million for placemaking and activation the other day without even asking for it. And I remember having long periods of advocacy to try and get the state government here to fund placemaking. So, that's the sort of quantum of the shift, whether it's parklets, children's play streets, outdoor entertainment, and live music. The floodgates have opened, and I guess the question for us is what's been that quantum shift and how do we leverage it? And I'll just touch on one of those. And I think that we're now dancing very differently. And before, whereas we had businesses compete over public space and they wanted a parking spot versus a parklet, and they didn't want to share with the business next door, and it was first in best dress to get the public space to the detriment of other businesses in the street. That conversation shifted, whereas before they didn't want to come to council or the local government because they were scared about what we might ask for in terms of permissions and compliance. They're now coming to us with ideas, and we've got a bureaucracy, if you like, that's geared to making that happen and improve things quickly. So that there's been a quantum shift in the compact between government and the community around public space, where it's a very collaborative effort. No one wanted this pandemic, but it's created the shift we've been advocating for years. And I guess just finally, the last is the political shift. Whereas I think a lot of the politicians I work with were interested in the big ribbon cutting capital projects. They understand the political capital from working with local communities now much better. Hence the check for $1.8 million that just arrived in my mailbox the other day. They understand that the community want to use public space differently, that there's political capital there by them acting quickly. So we're seeing that shift as well. So it's a wonderful opportunity, this new localism, and really shifting the nature of that relationship permanently so that we get collaborative creativity around public space going forward.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, and it's been quite a journey seeing this with you, learning from you that the central role of government really should be to build the capacity of communities to shape their places, not just to deliver them. And I think we're seeing that reinvention of roles happening in the pandemic. So speaking of that, I want to go to SHEILA, who's been also talking about governance and cooperative models of democracy and management of the public realm for a long time. She's a professor at Georgetown Law, focusing on the urban law and the commons. Wrote a book called The City as a Commons, and is about to come out with a book called The Co-City, which I can't wait to see, which is a case studies of many cooperative governance models around the world. And then SHEILA actually helped us launch Placemaking X with the Placemaking Europe conference in Valencia right before the pandemic as well. So it's really been a guiding force for us. I'm grateful for that. But SHEILA, tell us what you've learned during the pandemic? How are you thinking differently about some of your hopes and fears for the potential for the Commons to be able to help us address our biggest challenges, and how these models are emerging that may be replicable or scalable?
Sure. So thanks. It's great to be here. I think the pandemic, I'm not sure I learned a lot that's new in terms of how I approach these issues. I think it did underscore what a lot of us who are working in this area know, but many who are perhaps practitioners or in the broader world don't. And that is the kind of stratification of place. In the middle of the pandemic, when people were told to stay home or to stay in their communities, those weren't always communities that were in fact safe, either because you had multi-generational households or because there weren't parks that were safe places to retreat to. We know that people who were most prone to COVID infection, in particular in the US, Black and Latino communities, were in communities with high levels of air pollution. And so these were environmental justice communities. So the way that I've approached placemaking and place governance is that we have to bring under really critical view the places that we're remaking for folks, and what are the assets that they have there, and how the state, the government, can help them to exercise some control over those assets, to be able to co-produce and co-construct goods that they need, whether that's a park or clean streets or safe streets, whether it's a community garden in food insecure communities. And so the models that my team at LabGov and I have been looking at, and that my students at the law and the policy school at Georgetown, where I teach, as well as the law school, have been studying and gathering data on for many years, is what are the models that work in the most vulnerable communities that allow folks to exercise control over public assets. And sometimes there are public spaces, but sometimes they're abandoned and available goods to construct things like housing or wireless mesh networks and other things. So I think that we have to take a critical view of placemaking in light of, I think, the continued stratification and the inequality that COVID exposed. They said, and I'll end here, we had two pandemics. One was the health pandemic, and the other was
It looks like we're losing a bit of connection. SHEILA, we lost you there the last moment there, but thank you for bringing up all those points. Certainly we've long seen that the limiting factor for public spaces is public space management, governance, and obviously who it's done for and who it's done by has been a limiting factor as well for everybody's benefit, but certainly the people that have been left out of the process of shaping places. So I think, yes, the pandemic and many of the discussions, especially here in the U.S. around race inequality, have really challenged us all to our core to think deeper about this and frankly realize again the importance of placemaking to help communities articulate and realize their values, their vision, showcase them in the public realm, and make sure that people coming into those communities respect and conform to those goals as well. So heading to Guillermo, who leads the Fundación Placemaking Mexico, and has helped us also get Placemaking X off the ground over the last few years, and helped found Placemaking Latino America with many conferences all over the continent. But there's now 16 regional placemaking networks, but many are looking to Placemaking Mexico to see how to really scale impact. And during the pandemic, they've somehow been able to do dozens of projects all over the country. Tell us, why you're getting so much traction, so much momentum, so many partners from government, from the corporate sector, philanthropic sector to support placemaking in a way we've never seen before. Why is this going so wonderfully in Mexico around placemaking?
No, Thank you, Ethan, and thank you for having this conversation. But a lot of things I learn, and we learn from Peter. You know, like you teach us like how to see place capital, and then a lot of people see it based on the physical. And I understand that now we need to change the way we understand our physical capital, and we need to start physical distancing, but also supporting the economic capital, and of course without forgetting the environmental capital. But there is two main perspectives that we embrace, and that's the way you can see a lot of places that we are creating around the country. And it's the social capital, understanding the community leadership, the participations, the volunteering, and understanding that it's the way we can create so lighter, quicker, cheaper interventions, actions, places, and that actually create well-being. And that's what they are understanding, that of course the physical it's important, but this idea of creating and understanding the social capital, it's crucial to create and to transform our cities, but also the cultural one, giving signification, giving meaning to the places we are creating. And I think that's completely crucial. And that happened that they might look this, and I'm having the fortune traveling with you guys around the world, and I've seen the same exact park in the middle of Russia that in the desert in Mexico. And that's where we are not seeing how signification of the place, it's so crucial to understand and to create basically resiliency and well-being and expression and art. And that's what we're working on, and that's why we are counting almost 100 projects starting from the pandemic, and without actually traveling, understanding the local leadership, and basically participation around communities. So that's what I encourage everyone. Like, it's not about the money, it's more about the understanding that there is other options to create great places. And that's, I would say, that's the success we're having in Latin America, in Mexico. And of course it's challenging, but it's I think it's something that we can learn and we can replicate around our developing world, and even our world in general.
Thank you, Guillermo. And it is really inspiring to see the great energy for placemaking in Mexico and around Latin America, and the virtual gathering that's taken place. The cooperation around Latin America and across the world that we're seeing for the placemaking conversation. We're all actually gathering, the Placemaking Latino America Conference is gathering, thanks to Placemaking Cuba, one of the newest networks, in a few weeks for our City, Our Spaces conference that Guillermo's helping to organize. But let's go to how we to scale up what we're learning from the pandemic. How do we preserve what's happening that's working, and how do we make sure we also use this moment to really challenge the status quo in ways that it needs to be challenged, that we have a rare opportunity to continue to do so. How can we use placemaking and place governance to really disrupt and enable the change, the capacity that's needed to reach our biggest challenges? And this is something we're asking all of the sort of the Placemaking X network leaders around the world right now, because we're actually in the process of developing a charter that cities can use to chart their own course out of the pandemic, to state their own values and goals and learnings from the pandemic, to make sure they recover well, but while addressing the systemic issues that need to be addressed, and build resilience for future challenges of any kind that they may face. So this is an important conversation we're having, and we welcome other people in the chat and elsewhere to chime in on what should cities be doing differently around place right now to chart their future. So SHEILA, Peter, do you want to go there first, and what are you doing differently with Port Phillip, and then what should Placemaking X facilitate this globally?
So I think we've always talked in placemaking around how you take that sort of temporal shift from a sort of tactical, lighter, quicker, cheaper approach. That's the fascinator on the hat, as I've always said, for a deeper conversation. So how do you take that temporal shift and make it permanent? And I, just listening to SHEILA and Guillermo, I think we're all clear on what's the value of a great place. It's the creative capital, it's the social capital, it's the collaborative, place governance, as well as the economic capital, and it's balancing across that, the sort of private good and the public good. We've not just had an economic crisis, we've had a social crisis, and as she was saying, even in a place like Melbourne, it's our most vulnerable, who are already at risk of being isolated. So how do we take those temporal shifts in attitude, in beliefs, in views, and from a government perspective, put them into policy and put them into practice? So that's from an administrative point of view. How do you leverage the political capital, which is temporal, because you've got a minister going, I'm going to give people all this money for parklets and play streets. How do you take that and shift that into government policy and mindset? So you've got to, I'm just speaking from a government side of things, you've got to take the paradigmatic shift that's temporal in our politicians and put that into government policy and programs. And, I look at places like New Zealand, where the Department of Transport have just put $30 million out for placemaking projects for local governments across New Zealand. The New South Wales are doing some fantastic things in this space, where it's become not just a government policy, but they're then backing it up with programs. And then administratively, how do we, as I always say, dance differently to make it easier for our communities to collaborate around public space? And that's that shift away from a sort of risk-based compliance approach to an enabling approach. That's a cultural change within the bureaucracy, and we need to make that permanent. So, we were approving parklets in 72 hours. Pre-pandemic, it would have taken us 72 weeks, I'm sure. So how do you pick up that learning in your bureaucracy? And then in the community, how do you build on those temporal local place government, place coalitions, and build them into the way you work with your community into the future? So that means supporting them. You don't want to lose their creativity or agility. You don't want to put burdens on them like you have to be incorporated and all that stuff. But how do we take those temporary coalitions and strengthen them into true partners that can work with government into the future? They're the things for me that take this from a sort of temporal recovery response to a paradigmatic shift in the way we work with community around public space.
Such a powerful roadmap, Peter, that you're laying out for us, and I think the leadership of Port Phillip and other Australian cities are actually showing us a way. We've worked a lot recently with New South Wales government at a state level that are looking at how do they, following what you did in Adelaide and in Port Phillip, to really sort of turn upside down the shaping of cities, to start with place and public space. They have a minister of public spaces there. We've developed all kinds of toolkits for other sectors to collaborate, to evaluate public spaces, to try new things. The grant programs are really exciting, obviously, for seeding this type of activity and relationships, but then how it scales up into larger culture change within governance is really powerful. So SHEILA, tell us, you're the one that's really looked most broadly around the world at the models for cooperative governance or co-cities. You have this book coming out. How do we scale up our thinking beyond the temporal placemaking activities that everyone's seeing, that placemaking has become known for? How do we scale this up and broaden the impact in a sustainable, equitable, inclusive way?
Right. So I do think that the key is governance, and the models we've looked at in the toolkit that we were now refer to includes things like public community, private pacts of collaboration, for instance, or neighborhood or city-based labs, but even better, neighborhood-based labs, co-design labs, for instance. When we worked in Bologna has a new Office of Civic Imagination, right? Obviously, things like institutions like land trust, and also real estate or other investment cooperative organizations that allow some investment to come into the community, but that it not be extractive. Models of urban civic use, like Barcelona, Madrid, and Naples has, right, which allow certain kind of access and use to public and other spaces for the community to not only enhance their capacity around social capital, but also help produce the goods that they need. And then all kinds of finance and other models that support a collaborative, collective, circular economy in public and private spaces. And I say public and private is because, again, these things are interconnected. When people live in a community, they don't live their life just in public or just in private spaces. These things have to interact together in a way that makes sense and that supports their needs. So those are some of the things that we have both worked on, designing and helping cities kind of redesigning City Hall, so to speak, so that it works in this manner, but also have put together that enables kind of from the ground up mechanisms that allow for better place governance.
Thank you, Sheila. And I think your book couldn't be coming out at a more timely point when we all need to learn from this. And I get, one of our roles with Placemaking X is sort of the theory that everyone is learning a piece of this globally. Every part of the world is leading placemaking from some sector, but they're actually often blocking it from that same sector because that leadership is sort of taking up space in some ways. So we think it's really important to network the conversation globally, because each region has a strength and is innovating around place governance and placemaking in a certain way. And we don't want placemaking and place governance to be dominated by any one sector, any one perspective, demographic, and so forth. So by networking it globally, we democratize it. We accelerate the learning, hopefully, and hopefully the impact as well. So it's so important to have these conversations, and in your book, I know will be a foundation for many more conversations like this to come. Guillermo, so you're the closest to the ground, though, and that you're implementing this, and you're having so much fun doing it. And I got to visit some of the communities with you around Mexico earlier this year, the Latin American placemaking leaders have more fun than anyone else doing it. What do we all have to look forward to? I do think what a driver for this, what ultimately is going to make these ideas go viral, is showing how people are happy. How they connect with each other, how they connect with their place deeper. And how the process of placemaking accelerates that virtuous cycle. How do we all learn from Mexican placemaking, Latino American placemaking? How do we get this to go viral and to really have the impact we're all trying to have?
Yes. So I learned this from in the weirdest place possible. And I was with Peter and with Judith, and we were in Wuhan, China. And we were kind of speaking about this also, and that was 2018, I think so. I think, right? So it's how actually, and we were speaking about how actually to bring this temporarily public infrastructure into permanent infrastructure, and then this how to create this place attachment, and doing that as we do it best with activation, with events, testing, and failing also, and also improving from learning from our fails, and that's actually what I have seen. Like, there is a local place leadership around many communities, and bringing that into a formalization with a good model of place management, that will be for me absolutely key to keep our infrastructure, to keep our investments going. And that's something we all need, and that's something I see around governments, local governments, small governments struggling about how to actually live and create and understand that the place leadership is already there, and how to formalize it as a good model, and also how to, us as professionals looking at this, also how to actually build this place attachment much more structural, and to see we want to see back streets taken back by the cars. We don't want to see all this private sector investment not anymore in our public spaces. We don't want to see this place deregulation taken back, and that's something we need to work. And I think it's by formalizing good models for local place management and understanding that it's very different everywhere. There will work perfectly in some big cities, but also how can this actually work for this little small town lost in the middle of Mexico, and that there is these leaders and is willing of creating place, and how actually to formalize it to a more permanent management model. So that I will say that's what I'm trying also to figure out.
So we're all in this together. We're all figuring this out together. We think placemaking is an ongoing learning curve, and that's really I think the most important thing is that we keep this sort of these networks of these learning networks open, and obviously gearing it towards impact and inclusion as well. Who's not included, who's not part of it, the learning can often teach us the most. But I'd like to, thank, the panelists for being part of this. This is, we're looking forward to, much more of this. We're going to develop this charter together. So we'll keep this conversation going and hopefully help other cities go through their own conversation. We think this is a conversation that needs to happen at a neighborhood scale, citywide scale, everywhere, for people to chart their paths forward out of the pandemic, consciously and proactively. And I'd like to thank the folks at World City Residents and Chris Fair and Tim Asid and Anupam Yag as well, who's actually helping us start a Placemaking Singapore network and has built the Singapore stage for this conference, and has been a colleague as well. So there's folks in every corner of the world. I encourage everyone to connect on Placemaking X as well. You can sign up to be an advocate and connect with other advocates in your country, in your community, and then globally with people dealing with similar challenges and issues. Please feel free to reach out, but really appreciate everyone's participation and look forward to the many placemaking conversations that are part of this conference, including one tomorrow on inclusive placemaking that we helped set up as well, moderated by Mary Rowe, with Placemaking US's Madeline Spencer and Placemaking Europe's Charlotte Shans as well. So I encourage everyone to go to that one and many of the other placemaking conversations in the whole event, which, because we know placemakers also need to hear from all the other perspectives of and forces shaping cities. So thanks for including us. We look forward to collaborating on this and many other events together going forward. Cheers.